Greetings and welcome back to the Old Ways Rising Farm YouTube channel for our second video in the series on finding your own whetstones. A lot of the introductory information to this to understand how these stones form is in the first video. If you want to start the series from the beginning and work your way through, link at the top of the screen to video number 1. This is part of a larger project where I'm trying to describe a lot of the different minerals that occur around the world that can be directly gleaned from the landscape and used on your homestead for some productive purpose. That can be flint knapping, in the case of this novaculite, that can be whetstones. We're going to talk about carving, carvable materials, and other things like that as we go forward. But in this one, we're specifically talking about whetstones, finding them, and then in a third video, we will talk about cleaning them up and using them. And then in future videos, we will discuss specific locations where I will try to do the groundwork for you. So if you want to go and hunt up and find some of these things, you can go do that, know where to go and how to, what you're looking for. So all of this does take resources. If you're interested in supporting this project so I can do the legwork for you, we have a Patreon link at the bottom of the screen. If anybody wants to wander over there, I would be most grateful. But without further ado, we're going to talk about, in this video specifically, how to search, right? How to search is the goal of this. Part of that is where to search, and part of that is understanding the information that's out there. And your best friend when you're searching up minerals and rocks like this are the geologic surveys. But in order to understand the geologic surveys, you need to A, know what you're looking for, like qualitatively what a good whetstone is. And B, you need to know how to access the literature. And C, you need to understand the words. Okay? So we have an example of good natural whetstones here in front of me. I'm going to talk about all of them and use the words, and then I also have an example of literature on the Pennsylvania slate belt, which does make a good whetstone. This is an example thereof. And use that as an example of how we can use the literature to narrow down a search for a particular mineral. Now, one thing that I'll say before we continue here is you can find these stones in the literal wild, i.e. you pulled over to a probable looking stream bank or road cut and picked them up and took them home and split them into size and cleaned them up. You can also kind of find, we'll call it finding them in the wild side of suburbia, where you found something interesting at a garden center being sold as a flagstone, right? And that's very true. This piece of Pennsylvania bluestone is just one of those. It's broken. It's refuse, right? It's a piece of a broken sidewalk, right? These three came from a granite countertop place that I walked into and said, "Do you mind if I poke around your scrap pile? I'm looking for some rocks to use as whetstones." And first they looked at me weird, then it made sense to them, and they said, "Sure, go," and they sold me a whole bucket of stuff for like $10, right? It was real cheap. This came from a garden center. I don't have any local access to Arkansas novaculite, so these are just outright purchased. And these I picked from the Delaware River a few miles south of the water gap, right? So, you can get stuff truly from the wild or from the semi-wild. If you're in the semi-wild, you just need to know what you're looking at and how to evaluate it as a good stone. If you're going to look for these stones in the wild, then you need to know both what you're looking for and how it's described in the literature, as I mentioned a minute ago. So we're going to go through all of that, using these as some examples, okay? Now, from the previous video, you should understand the concept of sediment sorting into even size and the process of lithification, right? I'm not going to dwell on that any further, and we're going to start with the sedimentary materials and then move towards some metamorphic materials. And I will talk a bit about the metamorphic process when we get there. But first, I want to start with these, a tale of two sandstones. Okay, this is Pennsylvania bluestone, which is cemented by a reduced iron material. and you can tell that because it's the blue-gray color, which means reduced iron. It was iron-rich liquids that came in and glued the sediments together, and reducing means that it was submerged. It was underwater when this was formed. Okay, and this is from the Catskill Formation, which is sort of a river delta situation, very similar to what we see currently in southern Louisiana, right? That sort of mixed environment. And then this piece is a sandstone cemented by a yellow, orange, or red material, which means oxidized iron. I don't know what formation this came from, but this was cemented by, oxidized iron, which means that it formed above water. This formed on land, okay? Red means dry ground when you're looking at sedimentary rocks, as is yellow. This is just the difference of whether the oxidized iron is like a hematite primarily or a geothite primarily, right? But that's neither here nor there in terms of your use. And then we have water or wind refining the grit so that it's a consistent quality. Now, when we're looking at these natural stones, there's more than just what size is the grit, right? You can qualitatively say coarse, medium, or fine, but you can't just say it's equivalent to 220 grit sandpaper or something like that. We talk about why in the first video. You want to describe it in terms of what it actually does to the metal. So this orangey one is a little bit coarser in grit. You can just kind of tell that with the fingertip test, right? A little coarser than this piece, okay? And there's an additional difference. If you read the details on the Pennsylvania bluestone, you go to the literature and you read about it, this will be described as a feldspathic graywacky. Okay, what do those terms mean? Well, graywacky means it's a sandstone that has a substantial component of clay. Okay, substantial component of clay. 10-20% clay is going to be named as a wacky. Okay, whereas something which is just named as a sandstone is sand and cement, and that's it. Okay, and then if it's named as a siltstone, that means that the sand particles are a little bit smaller and just below like the visual threshold for individual particles, but not small enough to be itself clay. Okay, something which is primarily clay is going to be named as a mudstone or a shale. Sandstones and siltstones make very good whetstones if the grit is acceptable, meaning it's a hard material, which will do a good job of cutting your steel, okay, when you're sharpening. Now this one, from having used it, I would judge that this is not a graywacky. This is a true iron cemented sandstone. It's pretty much all silica. But this one being both a graywacky and feldspathic graywacky means that there's a lot of stuff in here that isn't silica, okay? So feldspathic means it contains a lot of feldspar. In the weathering process, the physical weathering takes your granite cliff and breaks it down into smaller clasts, as we discussed in the previous video. But then there's also chemical weathering, which certain minerals will break down in the presence of water to other minerals. Feldspar is one of those. Feldspar over time breaks down into clay, okay? Whereas sand, pretty much, it'll get into smaller and smaller silt, but it won't be converted to a clay mineral. Feldspar will. So that means that this sediment is younger than this sediment. Not in geologic age, but in quantity of time that it was filtering through the river system before it turned into sandstone. Okay? So when we have the feldspar component, feldspar is still very, very hard, okay, but it's not quite as hard and durable as silica. So when we're using this as a whetstone on soft iron, or if we're doing something like ripping rust off of the surface or mill scale off the surface of something which was just forged, the feldspar will do an equally good job of removing all of the softer or loosely attached materials. But it won't do as good a job as silica in cutting hardened steel. So this gives a differential cut. So when you're over soft material, it will cut very aggressively, just as aggressively as if it was pure sand, like pure silica sand. But when you get over the hard material, it will initially cut a little bit, but then the feldspar will blunt and it will burnish more than cut. So I love this chunk of bluestone when I want to rip off a surface and see what's underneath it, but I don't want to aggressively change the shape of the metal. It's really good for that. And this will rip the surface off of something I just forged if I want to just get in underneath the mill scale and see what's there before I choose what my next step's going to be. Or when I'm restoring a rusty tool, or, and those sorts of things. It will rip that off just as aggressively as 220 grit sandpaper. But as soon as I get into the hardened steel, it basically stops cutting quickly. And it doesn't leave deep scratch marks. So I can get under the surface, have a look at it, see what's going on, and then decide how I want to move forward without making any substantive alterations to the piece that I'm going to regret. Like, I'm not going to make deep gouges that I regret in the next step as I'm grinding to remove that gouge. Okay? This one behaves as pretty much pure silica. There's no differential cut between soft and hard. To the fingertip test, it's it's coarser than 220 grit sandpaper, but it cuts at about the same rate. Okay, that means it's been in the ground. It's been filtering through the erosion process for a long time. The clasps are relatively rounded, so it doesn't cut quite as quickly as an equivalently sized, super sharp, pointy, like garnet sandpaper. Right, it's probably like 80 grit equivalent in terms of physical size, but it cuts at the speed of 220. And because instead of sharp, pointy, freshly broken pieces of granite or garnet glued to your sandpaper, it's more semi-rounded clasps that have been filtering through a river for a long time. But that also means it makes a rounded U-shaped gouge in the metal instead of a real pointy one. So I really like this stone. If I've been grinding something on coarse sandpaper or a bench grinder or something like that, I like to go to this one because it's still a very coarse grit, but since it's rounded, I can rapidly cut through the deep grooves of the super coarse grit and use it as a transition step to finer stones. So you see, it's better to describe these things in terms of how they actually work than to describe them by taking out a microscope and physically measure the clasp size. Okay? And as you use more of these and you search for more of these, both in the true wild and in, like garden centers and countertop places, you'll get a sense where, you can kind of rub your fingers down one and have a pretty good idea exactly what it's going to do. Okay? And then you can either just take a little piece of sandpaper and sand off a spot and touch some steel to it, like I've done with these. I haven't fully finished these into, fully functional stones in the finished stone box. And do a little further test like that. But you'll get good at feeling them with your fingertips and having a general idea whether it's going to be something you want to use or not. Okay? Now, still staying in purely sedimentary, Arkansas stone. You can see the conchoidal fracture on these. This is a unique material. Arkansas is truly a unique material. There's no other formation on Earth that I'm aware of that's quite like it and does quite the same thing. Okay? This is silica as the material, the clasps, cemented with more silica. Okay? So because it's almost 100% silica with very little other impurity, it's classified as a chert. Now, cherts typically make absolutely atrocious whetstones. If you see chert in your geologic report, move on. Right? This is an exception to that rule. I've seen, trolling around the forums and stuff and seeing what people are using and looking for information around. I've seen people talk about, we have chert near us, and I know Arkansas stone is a chert, so maybe my chert will work too. No, it probably won't. Most cherts are formed where silica-rich water completely eroded away the original clasps that made up the formation and then replace them with almost pure silica. And it's going to be a very, very smooth cryptocrystalline material that will just have no tooth. Right? So it's going to be like trying to sharpen a knife blade on a window pane. Is it silica? Yes. Is it hard enough to scratch your knife? Yes. Is it going to actually sharpen your knife? No. It's just too smooth. Most chert falls in that category. This one is unique because the silica clasts that made it up are extremely sharp and aggressive. Okay? There's some argument out there over the source of the original clasts. The best guess modern summary that I can give you of that conflicting literature is that some volcanic activity enriched the silica locally in some seawater, which caused a lot of sponge growth, and some sponges have silica-based skeletons. And then those silica skeletons were deposited in that, maybe or maybe not. After that formation made its way on land, there was some wind action which sorted out all to one grit size. I can't find a firm confirm or deny on that in the literature, but I've seen it referenced. And then it was buried and cemented with more silica. Now, the different grits, right, so this bench stone and this little slipstone are soft Arkansas. This piece of knapping grade is, and the black is also a knapping grade. The black, the ultra hard, and the translucent are the hardest and finest. And then this is hard, which is intermediate in this range. So this one has to be understood on its own basis, independent of everything else on the table, because they all have the same grit size. But even though they all have the same grit size, there's a radical difference in performance between the soft Arkansas and the black and translucent grades. That difference is dictated by how much of the cement came in and filled in the pores. So in the soft, just enough silica came in to form it into a rock. But the pores are very, very large, which means the clasts being cemented together are very accessible to the metal you're grinding. Okay? The opposite extreme is the translucent. Those pores are almost completely filled in. There's still a sharp grit sticking out of those mostly filled in pores. But you, again, just like I was describing with the feldspathic sandstone, you have a combination of cutting and burnishing. Okay? That's why these are often used for a final, the black and the translucent are often used for a final stropping step with, for a hard strop, because there's as much burnishing action as there is cutting, or in the really hard grades, probably more burnishing action than cutting. But there still is some cutting, and because there still is some cutting, it can even off some of the high spots left by a coarser, more accessible grit. But because this is silica cemented with silica, it behaves much like a ceramic stone will, like a modern hard-centered ceramic stone, where you don't really wear the stone much at all, and you occasionally have to clean it with like a wire brush or steel wool or something to get the loading out of the pores, because it doesn't really wear away much. Okay? So this is unique on every level. It is a unique, one-of-a-kind, one-off rare set of circumstances deposit that just doesn't behave like anything else. Right? But it is true sedimentary. Okay? Now, when we get over here, the rest of the table, we need to start to talk about metamorphic processes. So, as discussed in the initial video, sedimentary rock is some set of clasts that is cemented by some extra material which comes in. But it's all physical. Right, my little demonstration of taking the water glass and mixing it with sand and it forms up into a solid rock, that's not really a chemical reaction, it's just physical precipitation of the silica which had previously been dissolved. Right? It's a physical change. You're not taking one type of clast and transforming it into a different type of clast with a different chemistry. When we go to metamorphic material, that's what we're doing. Okay? So there are some minerals which do not change in the metamorphic process. So if you have something which is cemented by, that is primarily composed of or cemented by lime, a limey material, calcium carbonate does not transform into any other mineral. What it will do is recrystallize. So limestone is composed of microcrystalline calcite, which gets the abbreviation micrite in the literature. Okay? That micrite gets compacted and partially dissolves and recrystallizes, gluing it together in cementation, right, as it's becoming a rock. So you end up with calcium carbonate cemented by calcium carbonate, but microcrystalline. When that's exposed to metamorphic forces, you break down the initial crystalline structure and you form larger crystals. So the limestone is transformed into marble. Okay? So limestone is purely micrite cemented by partially dissolved micrite. Marble is a much larger crystalline structure, but it's the same chemistry. It's still calcium carbonate. It hasn't changed. Okay? Your silica component does exactly the same thing. The silica will always be silica, but it will recrystallize and lead to growth of larger particle sizes of silica. So if this piece of silica is cemented by iron, and there's relatively little iron in it, was exposed and went through a metamorphic process, it would become quartzite. Okay? In this form, it's almost pure silica. In the quartzite, it's still almost pure silica, but the crystals are larger and more firmly adhered. Okay? Pretty much all the other minerals will transform into different minerals. So the clay, remember this is gray wacky, so it has a substantial clay component. And mudstone is almost all clay. Okay, we haven't talked about mudstone yet because mudstones and shales make absolutely atrocious whetstones. They are just too soft to do anything useful. Okay. Also, typically mudstones and shales form in ocean sediment deposits. The source of silica in most ocean sediments, obviously, rare exceptions do exist, that form in most ocean sediment deposits come from diatoms, which are free-floating brown algae. When you get a deposit of almost pure diatom materials called diatomaceous earth or diatomite, okay, it's just the silica shells from these little free-floating brown algae. And it's good. It's a good solid source of silica, but it's so small, it's not really going to do much because there's no tooth to it. Okay? But when that gets metamorphosized, it can recrystallize and grow in size, and we'll get there in a second. But your clay component, when it undergoes metamorphosis, becomes mica, the mica group of minerals. Okay? And the mica group of minerals are glossy, shiny, glassy plates. They can get huge. Like you can get big. Go and Google a book of mica, right? Biotite or muscovite mica. You can get big sheets of this stuff, and it splits on very thin layers. So what's happening is as you get more and more heat and pressure, the heat allows one mineral to break apart and allow the formation of another. And the pressure, you can only compress something so much. And if you want to compress it another step, it has to become a different something. So it's the combination of the heat and the pressure, which allows, if you have only heat, you won't go from clay to mica. If you have only pressure, you won't go from clay to mica. You need the heat to make it possible and the pressure to force the issue. And then you'll go from clay to mica. Okay? So you start with your shale. If it undergoes light metamorphism, it becomes slate and gets a little bit shiny, but you can't see the mica visually. Right? The mica are silt-sized, so they're below the visual threshold. When they just jump up into the visual threshold, it becomes a phyllite or phyllite, depending on who's doing the pronouncing. I'm not honestly sure which one is 100% correct. Probably an argument there. I'm not trying to start one. Right? So you go to, the first step is phyllite, where you can see the mica, but it's not big sheets. And then from phyllite, when you start to get big sheets of mica, it will then be called a schist or a schistose material. Okay? So you go from the sedimentary shale to metamorphic slate, then phyllite, then schist. And all of these things occur in the anthropological record being used as whetstones. There are wet slates, there are wet phylites, and there are wet schists. And then as this process is happening, the impurities will get converted into other stuff as well. Okay, so any carbon, right, if you have like an oil shale that's becoming a slate or a phyllite, the carbon component is going to be converted into graphite. Okay, past coal all the way to graphite. It never becomes a diamond. Diamonds are actually igneous, not metamorphic, right? They form in diamond pipes of volcanoes. It stops at graphite, but this is where graphite comes from. Graphite is fully metamorphosed carbon, and then it stops at graphite, right? So it's another one that does change but has an endpoint, okay? Then a lot of the other impurities can become other minerals and sometimes gemstones. So kind of the three real popular impurities that you'll see in a lot of different formations cropping up are chlorite, which is a green iron-based material, garnet, and then kyanite. Okay, is very, very common. And it's blue, right? Blue gemstone in good grades. So when you're adding those things, right, and those have gradients as well. Like kyanites can come from other things and become other things, right? But within the realm of things that we're going to be talking about as potentially useful as a whetstone, those are the three accessory minerals that you're going to see commonly, right? Chlorite, kyanite, and garnet, okay? Garnets themselves can be a grit if the stone stopped being metamorphosed, like in the heavily metamorphosed shale to lightly metamorphosed phyllite range, right? Like the Belgian blue hone, Belgian cauticle stones. The grit is very, very small, just starting to form garnets. So again, that's a unique in the world deposit where the metamorphic process stopped at just exactly the right place where the garnets could be the grit. Okay, so there's some interesting things there. But we're going to see a lot of partially metamorphosed sandstone and siltstone being used as whetstones. We're going to see a lot of slates being used as whetstones. And then I know that, you know, the historic museums in southern Pennsylvania, they're sitting around a lot of schists that had enough silica content they became a sandy schist that are being used as whetstones. Okay? You're not going to see them on the market being sold, but they do exist in the anthropological record being used as whetstones, right? So we're not going to talk about the whole range of metamorphic materials, just those. Right? And all of this is a sliding scale. Again, this information goes to understanding literature when you're trying to hunt up your own whetstones. All of this is a sliding scale. So I want to talk about these. These would both be classified as a sandstone, still as a sedimentary material, but they also both have evidence of some metamorphic process. I don't know exactly what they are. These are two that came in the bucket that I got from a countertop place, right? So I don't know exactly what they are. I'm pretty sure they said that this one comes from Europe somewhere, and I don't know about that one. But if you look in here, and hopefully it won't be too glary, I was trying to find a shady spot to cut out the glare as best I could. There's little black nodules in it. Those little black nodules are graphite. Okay. Hold it up a little bit.
Oh, yeah. There we go.
Can you see in there?
Yep.
Okay, thanks, beloved. Those little black bits in there are graphite. So this would still be described as a sandstone. It has no sparkle. It has not formed any schist. And the silica in it has not coalesced into large crystals that would bump it into quartzite territory. So it's not quartzite, it's not schist, so it still has to be a sandstone. This one might grade to siltstone, probably would, because you can't quite see the grains. You can feel it's scratchy when you scratch it, and it does work on steel. I haven't fully finished it, but I've played with the sides a little bit, right? So this piece of siltstone is hard, a lot harder than this piece of completely unmetamorphosed sandstone. So it's a lot harder, but it's still going to fall in the sandstone category, even though there is some evidence for metamorphism. Okay? And then this one is a little further along. It's a lot harder than this one. And if I look at the side, and the camera's not going to pick this up, but if I look at the fractured surface here, I can see that the silica particles have flattened and are kind of breaking on a platey structure, rather than a rough, uneven structure like this one. So this is starting to nose into the quartzite range. I'm honestly not 100% certain whether or not this would be graded exactly, as a sandstone or a weak quartzite. On some of the other fractures, they look more sandy. On some fractures, they look more platey. So this is one you could probably start an argument with, which bucket it would be classified as. But again, I've tested steel on the flat cut surface, and it does cut steel nicely. So I'm looking forward to finishing this one up. I want to get some other tools than what I have, which is why that one's not done yet. This one I just haven't had time. But I'm looking forward to finishing this one because I think this will be a great coarse ceramic-like stone for sharpening very hard, very pointy gravers and tools like that. That's my intended use for this one. Whereas if you try to sharpen a graver on something like this, that's really soft, it just gouges into the stone and doesn't really sharpen. So you need some really hard ones like this. So this that's just on, the knife edge between sedimentary sandstone and metamorphic quartzite is very, very promising for use in that category. But I want to get some bigger diamond files than what I have in order to finish it. Anyhow, these two that have some evidence of metamorphic action, but are still basically primarily a sedimentary rock in composition, would be described as an indurated sandstone. Indurated is a term which means made more durable, made harder. Okay? So it's a hard indurated siltstone or sandstone when you get into this category. So if your primary purpose for a stone is sharpening a large flat area on a relatively soft knife, these are not what you want. You want to go over to these. Okay? If your purpose is sharpening graving chisels or really small gouges, right, where you have a very narrow contact between the blade you're sharpening and the stone, an indurated sandstone is a very good option and something to chase out. Okay? This is why if you're working with a wide range of tools, you want a wide range of stones. And then, if I set these aside, we can look at the true metamorphic materials. So this I bought at a garden center. These two I picked out of gravel bar in the Delaware River. And these are slates. Okay? So the Pennsylvania slate is a black slate. Okay? It's black because it has a relatively high carbon content. I'm not sure if the carbon still shows up as a coal-like material or if it has transitioned over to a graphite-type material. Not 100% sure of that. But it is black because of the high carbon content. And we're going to talk more about this when I'm, moving forward here. But if you're looking and hunting this, one of the good places to hunt is your rivers. Okay? So a lot of Pennsylvania slate has made it into workshops around the East Coast because it was such an early settled area. And the Pennsylvania slate belt starts a little bit west of Allentown it doesn't go up to the Delaware Water Gap, it's a bit south of there, but it kind of goes from Allentown south, like Easton is kind of at the southern edge. The Blue Ridge Blue Mountain is a big, long, folded ridge north of Allentown. That's kind of the northern border. And then it goes east to the Delaware River and then bumps out a little bit into New Jersey. Okay? So I knew this was here, so when I had a chance to bump around a gravel bar, I was looking for some slate, right? Picked up a piece, just took a piece of 220 grit sandpaper, smoothed off the surface a little bit, and tried it. It does a very nice job of polishing steel. Okay? But right beside this, I also found this cobble. The surface is slate on this side, but if I look at this bottom, that little black bit, that's slate. But this little bit over here is siltstone. So this is a mixture of slate and siltstone. That's bad. This piece is straight up slate. This piece is a mixture. Okay? So when you have these multiple types of materials interbedding with each other, I picked this up for a teaching example, not because I'm ever going to finish it as a stone. Okay? That's something to look for. Mixed materials with different grits in close proximity. The siltstone is probably going to be a coarser grit than the shale, than the slate. But the slate will not cut as fast as the siltstone, so it's neither here nor there. Right? I said that slates form through the metamorphosis of shales. Shales make trash whetstones for a couple of reasons. I already mentioned that the silica grit that they contain is too small. It's also spread too far apart. It's usually not concentrated enough in the stone. And shales tend to be fissile. Fissile means crumble easily when exposed to air. That's not a description you want for a whetstone. If you're reading a geologic report and you see the word fissile, it means go away, don't look for whetstones here. Okay? But when these get compressed and metamorphosed into a slate, the recrystallization of the silica allows for a larger crystal size and a slightly coarser grit. So you go from something with no tooth at all to something which has a light tooth and is good for polishing in your final stropping. Okay? And then this piece is a good example of transitions in the cement. So in all of these, the clay is being converted to a mica, so it's getting a little glistening. But then that clay was cemented by something, probably iron. The iron gets converted to chlorite. So this is a chloritic slate, and you can see that it's a chloritic slate by the green color. Okay? This one is a black slate because of the organic content. You can also have a red slate where the iron is still iron and hasn't been converted all the way to chlorite. Okay? Chlorite is a lot denser than iron oxides. Okay? So the transition from iron oxide to chlorite, you get an increase in the density of the rock, which means that the matter is packed into a smaller volume, which also means that the silica is closer together. And the words chloritic slate are very good words if you want to look for a whetstone. Because pretty much every chloritic slate I found any reference to anywhere, I could also find reference to being used as a whetstone. I'm guessing this is probably from the New York slate belt, which is on the eastern border of New York, which does have red and green slates mixed together. And in some, you can even see dappling where you have a red slate with green blotches. So the transition from iron oxide to chlorite is just starting. And I do know for a fact that those have been used for a whetstone. Just as I know for a fact that just about everything in every stone material that's part of the Pennsylvania slate deposits is useful as a whetstone, including, if you find a good piece, the siltstone components. Right? So, again, green slate, you see that at a garden center, buy a chunk. Right, I got this. This was a long chunk. It was about out to here, and I split it with a wedge into a couple of pieces. Now you can see when I split it, like, and force it to break right across the grain that it wants to break on, that it does separate into some layerings, and that's a relic of the layering of the sandstone that it, or the shale that it came from. But instead of being fissile, it holds together really well. If this was its original shale form, and I forced it to break like this, it would have just crumbled into rubble in my hands and wouldn't even still be a rock. But because it's compacted and recrystallized, it will hold together. So it has that extra little bit of strength that you can forcibly grind against it without it falling apart. Okay? Other slate belts. So here on the east coast of North America, I mentioned the New York slate belt. I know for a fact it has been used for whetstones. The Pennsylvania slate belt, I know for a fact it's been used for whetstones, both the slate and the siltstone component, and I have verified that through my own experiments. But then there's also a slate belt in North Carolina. And I know for a fact that has been used for a whetstone because there's old literature on whetstone quarries in that region. And Roy Underhill, in one of his books, visited one of those quarries and made whetstones out of it and was pleased with the results. Okay. There's also a lot of phyllite in the North Carolina whetstone, or the North Carolina slate belt. There's a material called Duke stone that's sold far and wide because it's a really nice glistening phyllite that's sold in a lot of garden centers and for a lot of like tiles, for stone tiles. I don't know if that makes a good whetstone or not. And then the Pennsylvania slate belt kind of evolves into the schistose material down around, when you get closer to Philadelphia. And the sandy schists, not all of that schist is good, but the sandy schists are and show up as whetstones in museums from time to time. Now, I'm giving you a lot of hints. How do you go out into your area and make some educated guesses on where to start looking? So, you can go to a garden center and play with these and, do the fingertip test and scratch it. Does it have any, tooth to it when I run my fingernails across it, and know some of these things and make some good educated guesses. And usually you're only risking like $5 or something, right, to buy a little sample of stone. This one works very nicely. This one I had finished up and have polished, have done quite a bit of sharpening on that one already. But if you're not at a garden center and you're just reading the literature, well, you can start to look at what's been used. So go to your local historic societies. If you see whetstones in their collection, especially from really old places where they weren't being purchased, right? Houses and settlements that were built, in the 17 and early 1800s before there was whetstone trade. They're using something local. You can go look at what those are. You can see, is it a sandstone? What color is it? Right? Is it blue-gray? Is it like blue or gray sandstone where I'm looking in the literature for a marine deposit, or red where I'm looking for a terrestrial deposit? Is it a slate? Is it a schist? Right? What am I looking at? You can make some very good educated guesses that way. Go to historic houses in your area. And when you go to the historic house, go to the front door. Look at the flagstone in front of the front door. And look at usually the back left corner. And see if there's a divot there. There usually is. Because that's where, great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother who established that house sharpened her kitchen knives, and where her husband sharpened his axe. Right? So if you're just on a homestead where it's a challenge even to buy in enough fabric to make clothes, you're not importing a whetstone, or let alone a flagstone for your porch. And you're going to opportunistically choose the best whetstone to be your flagstone. It's just an intuitive thing that the farmers in that era would do. See what it is, and then go look at the local geologic maps, see what's around, and try to find the best pickings. Right? Because even if it's not awesome, it's probably something. Okay? And flint knapping stone is hard to find. It's hard to find really good cherts for flint knapping in most of the country. There's a few areas that are just like unbelievably blessed with cherts, but most of North America is a little chert poor. But it's not sedimentary rock poor, right? So if we look at the East Coast, you know, up along the eastern border of New York, there's a slate belt that I know has good whetstones in it. And then we move a little south. Once you run past that, you got to drive 100 miles or so until you get into the bluestone containing areas. And then once you're out of the bluestone, you're immediately into the Pennsylvania slate. Then once you're out of the Pennsylvania slate, you immediately have access to the sandy schist down in the Philly area. And if you're a little west of there into Lancaster County, there's red sandstone, which has made a lot of porches, which all have divots in them. Okay? And then once you get down there, I don't know that much about what's in Virginia, but then we hit the North Carolina slate belt. Right, so all up and down the East Coast, there's just a proliferation of these. There's historic sources, documentation to back up a lot of these in the written literature, and I'll put a lot of links in the description box of this video. But there's just a lot of stuff around. Some of it's documented, some of it you might have to do a little bit of legwork. But hopefully these terms will help you understand the literature. And before we part, I want to share with you some of the literature pertaining to the Pennsylvania slate belt. And I will definitely put a link. This is a public domain article. I will definitely put a link to it in the description box if you want to go and look for some of the Pennsylvania slate. This is Geological Survey Bulletin 1244-H. The Martinsburg Formation, yada, 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 some extra words. Okay. The Martinsburg Formation is the description for the large geologic unit which contains this slate. Okay. So when we go and we pull, I apologize, my printer is low on toner, so it's got a toner stripe. But if we look through this, all of these have maps. Okay. So, right, if you look right here, I'll use this as a pointer. This little black line is the Delaware River. Okay. That little
That's
black
not showing
line
up
there.
at all. There's too much glare.
Too much glare? Okay. Well, we have maps. The black line is the Delaware River. Maybe you'll be able to see this on a television screen, maybe not. That's the downside. The beauty of this digital format is I can share this info with everybody in the world. The downside is there's just some things that cameras don't pick up. But then as we read through the description of the Martinsburg Formation and the Martinsburg Slate, it's composed of different structural members, which are smaller units stacked on top of each other. Okay. So the bottom unit is the Bushkill member, and if we read about the Bushkill member, it's a black or gray to brown slate, which contains very thin interbeds. Interbeds is describing the layering of the material within the member, okay? And it's describing them as thin, from as thin as 1/8 inch to as thick as 3 to 4 inches, okay? And then we read on, and it describes that there are some inclusions of siltstone, but it's primarily slate. We go on, we look at the middle member, which is the Ramseyburg member, okay? So this is the middle layer of our layer cake. It's described as thick-bedded slate and graywacky, okay? The bedding is from 1 inch up, but it averages 1 foot in beds, okay? So if you look at this piece, this would be one bed. It broke cleanly above and below, but when we look on its natural edge, there's not a lot of obvious layering or facility in there. Okay, it's not fissile within the bed, right? When you look at this piece, you see there's a lot of little cracks in it, okay, going down through. So this is thinly bedded, this is thickly bedded, okay? So this piece that I picked up is far more likely to be from the lower Bushkill member. This is probably Bushkill, and because it's not thickly bedded, it's probably not Ramseyburg. Okay, so this is probably a sample of Bushkill member slate. And then if we look on, we can read all of the details about the bushkill member. The top member is the Penn Argyll member, which was the most mined. It's the darkest black. It's a mixture of thick and thin beds, okay, with relatively little of the greywacke, okay. So this is probably bushkill. This piece, where I have the mixing of the siltstone and the slate, is probably the Ramseyberg member, okay, because that's the one with the most greywacke in it. Greywacke siltstone, okay? So this geologically would have probably been at the bottom, and this probably in the middle, close to the transition, because the Ramseyberg layer has foot-thick chunks of the siltstone in it, which I also know from, literature and forums and museums that this siltstone has been used as a whetstone as well, if you get a pure section of it. And then the Penn Argyll would be on top, the highest silica and the hardest and the blackest of the three layers. So, even though, you read this, thin bedding and fissile are words that say probably not the best, I have a thin bedded piece that's holding together well enough to use as a whetstone. Okay? I want to go and do more hunting in this area and to find some pure lumps of the siltstone to examine and some chunks of the Penn Argyll member that's the highest silica shale to examine and compare all three and talk to you about. Again, like I mentioned in the beginning of the video, that takes resources, and I'm working on it. If you want to help, Patreon. I'm working on it. It'll be there eventually, one way or the other. Okay? So, you get these reports. Start with your museums, with local knowledge, with your own physical observation of historic sites, and with forums. And just see what the conversation about a region is. Then with that information, go and pull these geologic reports for your area and pick through them and narrow it down. And then when you want to go see and you want to gut check, is this worth anything or not? Go find the biggest river which cuts through the area of interest and start picking up a bucket of river pebbles. Okay? And from those river pebbles, usually most of the material, obvious exceptions are obvious, most of the material that's going to be a good whetstone, you can just take a piece of 220 grit garnet paper, wet it, sand it down a little bit, and take your pocket knife and polish on it a little bit, and you'll get a very quick read on how it works. Okay? You don't need to finish a whole stone. You don't need a huge sample. You don't even need to find the best sample that's ultimately going to be your new favorite bench stone. You're just doing a gut check. In the streams, you're doing a gut check. Okay? Is there something here that's worth my attention? If yes, then go back to those reports. Start hunting terrestrial exposures. Road cuts, the banks of rivers where you can find a piece that's more intact maybe. Those sorts of environments, and narrow it down. And you can reach out. I've reached out to historic societies before. Reach out to family members if you have family or friends in a particular area, and you'll start to get the local information and narrow down the sites. Because if there's good stuff there, somebody's used it and somebody knows about it. You've just got to shake enough hands and ask enough questions to get to that somebody who's willing to talk to you, right? And people are busy, and some people think, oh, I found a magic new whetstone, I'm going to get rich on it. No, you're not. It's maybe you'll make $10 once a year, but nobody's getting wealthy mining whetstones these days. It's just not a thing that happens, really. Yes, in Japan, there's the prestigious old mines that are still worked, but that's more for cultural reasons than because they're actually magically better than anything else in the world. That's more of a cultural legacy than actually being better, right? You can find whetstones in North America that are every bit as good as anything else anywhere in the world. So there just isn't enough market for that to be wealthy. But I mean, some people still want to keep their secret sites and their secret recipes, and when you bump into them, respect them. Just, okay, thank you for being willing to talk to me at all. And
Respect the boundary.
Respect the boundary. They set a boundary, respect the boundary, move on, talk to somebody else and get your info. Okay? So, but the information is available, and I hope that this little conversation helps you conceptualize natural whetstones, how to describe them, what makes them, the forces at play, and gives you some of the tools to be able to sort through. Our chickens are being crazy. That's okay. It gives you some of the tools that you need to sort through the literature and be able to access the information that you need to narrow down your search. And I hope this video has been useful for you like that. Again, I do intend, all of the sites that I mentioned, I intend to get to. I have feelers out to several of them already. I also am planning to try, and I have feelers out to the Hindostan deposit in Indiana, trying to get out to there. And at some point when I have the budget to be able to travel, I hope to be able to get to Arkansas, visit some of these sites and some of these classic whetstone sites, right? It's in the works. Right now I'm a little bit time limited and resource limited, so, again, if you want to accelerate this project, you can wander over to the Patreon. But either way, I hope that you will join us next time here at Old Ways Rising Farm and have a wonderful, blessed week in the meantime.